Time at Work is a highly configurable software system for the management of professional services. It comprises modules that cover timesheets, expenses, billing, attendance forms also, the planning and budgeting of employees' activities or projects, and contains extensive reporting possibilities using grids, Excel, Crystal Reports, or Microsoft Reporting Services. Time at Work doesn't include an accounting module on the assumption that transactions will be exported using XML and XSL into whatever financial system that you are using. In an earlier introductory video, I explained the way in which timesheets work and can be configured in different ways. In this video, I'm going to be talking about expenses, or more generally, forms. To illustrate this, I'm going to log in as Stephen Hughes into the standard demonstration database. You'll see straight away that we talk about forms rather than expense forms. And that is because forms can be configured for a wide variety of different purposes. Almost every company that uses Time at Work will use forms for expenses. But some can also take advantage of the configuration of workflow and calculations to use forms for other purposes as well, such as absence requests or purchase requests, a kind of procurement, a simple kind of procurement mechanism, or the registration of incoming invoices, whether they are project related or not. So there are many ways in which the system can be configured. We'll start, however, with expenses. In this particular configuration, we have 3 forms available for expenses. These could, in fact, be combined into one form, but for the sake of simplicity, they're separate here. It's a matter to some extent of taste as to whether you want one large form that is capable of everything, or several smaller forms with less complex logic that can do separate things. If, for example, you are a company that doesn't do very much foreign travel, then you would probably want employees not to have to bother with choosing currency codes. So in this case, you would have a separate non-foreign expense form so that no currency needs to be entered at all, and then a separate currency oriented expense form for foreign travel, but they could be combined. Let's start by looking at a very simple expense form for non-foreign expenses. In this configuration, as an employee, note that there are these tooltips here. I could enter a generic description that, just for my purposes, will help me to remember this form, such as trip to London. And then I am simply recording the date of the expense, the project against which the expense is incurred. Now, in many cases where it's an internal expense, you choose an internal code because you're not going to recharge this expense. But we may be incurring the expense against a client project, and we may or may not want to recharge that. We may have an image of the expense, an image of the receipt. And so I can, for example, upload from my own PC. I'm going to choose a picture of a koala bear and upload that into the system and assign it to this expense. I then may specify the type of expense. You can have as many as you like of these. I'm going to say that I took the train. This is a travel expense. These expense types are actually going to be used for presetting or setting the account code that will be required for the transaction that this will generate across into your financial system. So you can have account codes associated with each expense type. But of course, you don't want the employee, Stephen Hughes, to have to bother with account codes. So they could be set by using these categories here. So on a train to London. Now here I have a status field, and I can indicate whether the expense is to be charged to the client or not. I'm going to say it's chargeable. This field you may or may not choose to have in your expense form. In some companies, this decision about whether something is chargeable or not is made at a later stage by the account manager or project manager. But in this particular configuration, Stephen Hughes is indicating chargeability himself. Of course, it can be modified by others later. And I'm going to say that it cost £145.34. If I click on Save and Validate, it simply checks that the values make sense, and it's saving this form so that I can now abandon it if I want and come back and complete it later. I'm going to add one more expense by copying this line. We'll say that I had some accommodation in London as well. And this is also chargeable, and it's £245. So I can build up an expense claim in this way. I'll just illustrate one other thing. If I choose to allocate some costs, incidental, some other costs against an administration project rather than against a chargeable project, you'll see that in this case, the status is not available for entry. And that's quite appropriate because the chargeability of this expense to administration is irrelevant. It's just a cost for the company. So that's a very, very simple expense form. And I'm now going to submit that. And when I submit it, the system determines that it should now go to Simon Singh. I'll explain how that works a little bit later. But what happens now is that Simon Singh will get an email telling him that there is an expense to authorize. And he will then log into the system, and he will see that he has, in fact, in this case, 2 expenses to authorize. This is the one that we've just entered, number 45, the trip to London. I open that. Simon Singh doesn't have the option to modify anything here, which is appropriate, but actually you can set the system up so that some fields are modifiable. But here none is modifiable. And Simon Singh can do a number of things. He can, if he wants to, return this form and say, no, utterly unacceptable, and return the entire form to Stephen Hughes for reconsideration. Or he may decide that there's only one line that he wants to return. This is an option. You can switch this on and off by form type. But this particular form type allows Simon Singh to return just one line using this partial return option. And of course, when he does do these returns, emails are generated to Stephen Hughes to tell him that there's an expense form coming back. But of course, what Simon Singh would normally do is to click on Authorize. And then the form goes to Mahmoud Abiad. And in this configuration, Mahmoud Abiad is the bookkeeper for this company. When he logs on, he sees this latest news, which we will ignore now, and we'll click on Forms for Review, because Mahmoud Abiad is the reviewer of this form. He opens the form, and what you will see now is that the form looks slightly different. All the data that Stephen Hughes entered and which Simon Singh authorized are still there, but there are some new fields. At the review stage of a form's workflow, there are additional options configured. We assume that an employee is not going to understand whether VAT or tax on a receipt or a bill is recoverable or not. That really is something that the bookkeeper would investigate and know. So it would be the bookkeeper that enters, for example, a tax value which the company can recover. And then you'll see that there are the net value of the expenses now this, and so that is the actual cost to the company. You'll see that it also converts, irrelevant in this form, it converts values into local currency. Now this is a form where we are dealing entirely in local currency, so the converted values are actually the same as the entry value. values. But as you'll see in the foreign form, you're able to enter into these initial fields foreign currency values. And then, of course, you would see them converted here into local currency values. And here you see the account codes that are preset as a consequence of these expense types. Sometimes, actually, you can set it up so there are a range of account codes to choose. In this case, there's only one. So there's nothing for Mahmoud Abiad to do other than to confirm that these are the right account codes. And so when he's happy with this, he will review it, mark it as reviewed. He could also, of course, return the form if he's querying something. But we'll just click on reviewed. And the form is then posted. And just as timesheets are posted to what we call the actuals project ledger, so expense forms or forms are also posted to the actuals project ledger. And they sit there as work in progress, waiting for the invoicing module to pick them up and bill them. Let's do one other form very quickly. Actually, Mahmoud Abiad doesn't create forms, so I'll go back and I'll log in as Stephen Hughes. And I'll create one more form, the foreign expense. And you'll see that that is very, very similar. This time it's going to be trip to Paris. Date. Project. We won't bother with an attachment. Accommodation. Hotel. Chargeable to the client. And here we're going to say 320 euros. When I click on Save and Validate, the system is actually showing me what these values are in local currency as well. And when I post this, when I submit it rather, it will go through the same authorization workflow. So what I was illustrating there is that forms can be configured to work in different ways. I'm going to switch across now to the administration module just to indicate some of the kind of configurability and flexibility that the system has. When Stephen Hughes clicked on Create Form, he was presented with various possibilities of form type. And here all of these form types are defined. We were looking earlier at the not foreign expenses and the foreign expenses. Let's look at not foreign expenses first. There are a very large number of parameters that can control the way a form looks and behaves. And I certainly won't explain all of those now, but I simply want to indicate the vast variety of possibilities there are. Here we're setting pixel widths and various things like that. But most critically there are calculations. If you remember, in timesheets, there are 20 calculations that can be defined that operate on a time value entered into a specific cell. Here also, there are 20 calculations, but they work in a different way. Some of them are visible. As you saw, we entered an expense total. And in the case of the foreign expense, we entered an expense total under foreign currency. But then behind the scenes, there were hidden calculations, some of which were revealed at review stage for Mahmoud Abiad. So you see here that in calculation 1 is a visible and enterable calculation. Calculation 2 was visible and enterable at review stage. So there are a lot of calculations that can be defined. These, as I said in the case of timesheets, are defined for several purposes. For accounting purposes, these calculated values can be sent across to the accounting system. They can be defined for invoicing purposes. These values are going to be placed onto invoices to clients. And thirdly, they may be values that you want for management reporting. So, for example, in a multi-company, multi-currency database, you may recalculate everything into a single currency for corporate-wide reporting. In this demonstration database, there are, I think, 5 companies, but the corporate currency is GBP. So you'll see that in all forms and in all timesheets, certain values are calculated into GBP, regardless of the transaction or company local currency. This takes a lot of thought, and of course you don't need to do any of these things. Time at work can be set up in a very simple way or in a very sophisticated way. And importantly, that simplicity or sophistication is under the bonnet, as it were. These calculations are invisible to the end user. Stephen Hughes is unaware of them, but they're tremendously useful for management purposes. So there are a lot of parameters here. You will have noticed that there are other kinds of form as well. Let's look at absence request. Here I'm going to say, put today's date, but I'm going to say that I want to be absent, or Stephen Hughes is going to say he wants to be absent on holiday from the 15th of July to the 19th of July. And this form does an entirely different kind of thing. It's calculating the day's absence, and when he clicks on submit, again, I think it'll go to Dave Barber for authorization, a different person in the organization. Because just as with timesheets, you can define what we call the routing rules for a form. That expenses not foreign document went first to line manager, and then it went at review stage to the bookkeeper, who was Mahmoud Abiad. Could have done a lot of other things, and it could have done things conditionally. One thing that people often ask is, can we route a form that has a total value of more than a specific value to a particular person? The answer is yes. We could say, for example, that if the value of one of the calculations, it doesn't matter for now which it is more than 1,000, then the form will, after it's been authorized by the line manager, also go to the financial director. These are the kinds of rules that you can set up. But in this case, it's actually very simple. But you see that in the case of the absence request, we sent all absence requests initially to the finance director. So you can have different routing rules for different form types and control very carefully where the form goes. That, I think, is enough for a start of explanation of forms. So thank you for listening.